This is Bitnar Talks, the engineer takes on construction. Episode 30. Hi, I'm Piotr Bitnar. Each day I help my clients plan and design building projects through Bitnar Limited, a consulting chartered structural engineer's practice. My biggest passion and the cornerstone on which I've built my business is finding clever solutions for construction projects. I am a chartered structural engineer and a budding software developer, so you can rest assured that I will strive to talk about the best practices and the use of new technologies in the industry. And if you're embarking on a construction project or are involved in planning, designing and building the world around us, you'll find this podcast useful. Approved Document M, Access to and Use of Buildings, Volume 2, Buildings Other Than Dwellings. Hi, and welcome to Bitnar Talks, your favorite podcast on all matters of architecture, engineering and construction. It is Sunday the 13th of October 2024, and I'm here back with you with the 30th episode and information on Approved Document M, Access to and Use of Buildings, Volume 2, Buildings Other Than Dwellings. It's been another busy period, including a smashing day at this year's Kent Construction Expo 2024. At our stand 365, we had the pleasure to meet and greet many great people of Kent's construction sector. We were luckily placed next to the Brunel Theatre, do not mistake for Bitnar, where many great people were addressing Building Safety Act. It was great to see people hopefully standing in the queue before the doors of the theatre opened and talking to us, and then seeing them more confused than ever before when they left the doors of the theatre. No doubt the Building Safety Act takes time to get used to, and we'll see some amendments in near future. Alright, never mind the days gone, let's move on to this episode. The last episode treated on the accessibility of dwellings. Let's get quickly through the recap and see what was covered last week. In the last episode, I talked about the first volume of the Approved Document M, Access to and Use of Buildings, dealing with dwellings. In section 0, which always directs us into a meaning of it all, the document covered access and usability requirements for new dwellings and material alterations, excluding extensions. It categorizes dwellings into visitable, M4-1, accessible and adaptable, M4-2, and wheelchair user, M4-3 dwellings. That is requirement M4 and paragraph 1, 2 and 3. Planning permission may impose optional requirements, which are this for the paragraph 2 and 3. Part M takes precedence over Part K in cases of conflict and should be used alongside the Equality Act and other regulations. Section 1, Category 1, Visitable Dwellings. Visitable dwellings must ensure basic access for disabled visitors. A toilet should be available on the entry or principal floor, with step-free access and reachable controls for individuals with limited mobility. Section 1A, Approach to the dwelling, covers the approach. It must be safe, unobstructed, at least 900 mm wide, with a surface that's not slippery. Ramps and step routes must meet gradient and size requirements. Communal entrances must be accessible with doorways at least 775 mm wide, and lifts should accommodate wheelchairs. Section 1B, Private entrances and spaces within the dwellings. Private entrances should provide level access with internal doorways and corridors wide enough for wheelchairs. Water closet facilities must allow wheelchair access, and electrical fixtures should be installed at accessible heights. Section 2 covers Category 2, Accessible and Adaptable Dwellings. These dwellings should accommodate diverse needs, allowing future adaptation for disabled or elderly occupants. The design should allow easy modification, like installing grab rails or stair lifts, without major structural changes. Section 2A covers approach to that dwellings. Approaches must provide step-free access, allowing for future adaptability. Ramps, entrances, and routes should be designed to support easy modifications to meet changing accessibility needs over time. Section 2b covers private entrances and spaces within the dwelling, where internal spaces should be adaptable for future needs, ensuring door widths and circulation areas accommodate aids or adaptations. This design flexibility ensures that spaces remain accessible as occupants' needs evolve. And then we move to section 3, which is category 3 dwellings, which are wheelchair user dwellings. These dwellings must either be fully accessible to wheelchair users or adaptable to meet their needs. If planning requires category 3 compliance, these standards override category 2. Section 3a deals with approach to the dwelling. Approach routes must offer step-free access from parking or extended now areas with ramps, stairs and lifts designed to accommodate wheelchairs. This ensures full accessibility from any point to the dwelling. Section 3b, private entrances and spaces within the dwelling. Private entrances must be level, with doorways, rooms and circulation spaces designed for full wheelchair use. Kitchens, bathrooms and other facilities should be pre-configured or adaptable to meet wheelchair users' needs. In this episode, I will move to approved document M, Access to and Use of Buildings, Volume 2, Buildings Other than Dwellings. Luckily, a new change to the regulation just kicked in last week, hence we are fresh on the delivery. So without further ado, let's dive straight into this. In this episode, I'll talk about the statutory guidance contained within the approved document M, Access to and Use of Buildings Volume 2, Buildings Other than Dwellings. The requirements of Part M are contained within 4 parts, but only the Part 1 to 3 are applicable to buildings other than dwellings. I will therefore start with reading you the requirements M1, M2 and M3 paragraphs and then move to what is covered in the approved document. All these 3 requirements are covered in 5 sections of the documents, sections 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this approved document. Alright guys, starting with the text of the legislation. Access to and use of buildings other than dwellings. Requirement M1. Reasonable provision must be made for people to A. Gain access to and B. Use the building and its facilities. Requirement M1 does not apply to any part of a building that is used solely to enable the building or any service or fitting in the building to be inspected, repaired or maintained. Requirement M2, which deals with access to extensions to buildings other than dwellings. Suitable independent access must be provided to the extension where reasonably practicable. Requirement M2 does not apply where suitable access to the extension is provided through the building that is extended. Now, sanitary conveniences in extensions to buildings other than dwellings, requirement N3. If sanitary conveniences are provided in any building that is to be extended, reasonable provision shall be made within the extension for sanitary conveniences. Requirement M3 does not apply where there is reasonable provision for sanitary conveniences elsewhere in the building, such that people occupied in or otherwise having occasion to enter the extension can gain access to and use those sanitary conveniences. As ever, the requirements are simple, the interpretation of them may not be such, though, but the only dictionary between us and the legislators are approved documents. So let's have a look, what does this one say? Starting with the section 0, which follows the typical introduction of the guidance, the legislator is happy that the requirement is met if it meets the performance, allowing everyone who wants to gain access to the building or within the building or to use the building facilities to do so without inhibition concerning their age, gender or disability, and that goes for visitors and people who work there. The requirements apply to new buildings as well as the existing buildings that undergo material alteration extension or material change of use to a hotel, boarding house, institution, public building or a shop. The guidance also reminds us about the Equity Act 2010 to think about as an employer, about physical barriers created by features in the building. When it comes to the extensions, these should be treated as new builds, so the accessibility needs to be addressed in some way, and it concerns the route all the way from the site boundary or on-site car parking to the new building. Similarly, with sanitary conveniences provisions. In either case, we can rely on the existing building to provide it, but it needs to be appropriate, and if it is not, we may need to think about upgrade, should we like to use it instead of providing such in the new building. Now, as ever, material alterations cannot make the situation worse, and material change of use will likely lead to the necessity of an upgrade. In the gist, when the requirement M applies, people should be able to navigate to and in between buildings or buildings and should be aided whenever needed and possible. Educational establishments should have proper regard to the requirements, and in the case of historical buildings, some concessions may need to be made. As designers or specifiers, we need to demonstrate to the building control how we address the functional requirements of the regulation, which in most cases will be by following this document. Moving on to section 1, which deals with access to buildings, which covers, guess what? Access to buildings. Access is considered from the boundary or parking to the building and between buildings within a complex. Many things to consider here, including people with different abilities traversing these routes. The document directs us to the publication called Inclusive Mobility, a guide to best practice on access to pedestrian and transport infrastructure for the detailed guidance. The section then goes on to cover level approach from the boundary of the site and car parking, on-site car parking and setting down, ramped access, stepped access, handrails to external stepped and ramped access, hazard on access routes. Level approach from the boundary or parking space should be exactly that, leveled, for as long as it's possible. Gradients over 1 in 20 should be ramped, surface should be easy to traverse and wide enough to allow uninhibited passing by users. Generally, at least 1.8 meter wide, but down to 1.2 meters may be acceptable in certain more constrained circumstances. People should not be prone to hurting themselves when passing around the perimeter of the building under all light conditions. The level approach should be at least 1.5 meter wide with passing places and free of obstructions to the height of 2.1 meter. Passing places should be 1.8 meter wide and at least 2 meter long, and spaced no further than 50 meters apart, but visible between each other, so that the users can plan to rest at one to allow passing of someone else. Crossfall to be max 1 in 40, and gradient usually max 1 to 60 generally, but if ramped, it can be up to 1 in 20, with a landing every 500 millimeter rise. The surface should be firm, durable, and slip resistant with undulation no more than 3 millimeters under 1 meter straight edge for formless materials. In the material used varies along the way, it should maintain its frictional characteristics. You know the feeling when you slip all of a sudden when stepping on the wet floor in the stores, yeah? We want to avoid that. For paving, the units should be leveled to within 5 millimeters difference, with joints up to 10 millimeters when filled and 5 millimeters when not filled. The route to the principal entrance should be well lit and signed. Walking path should be generally separated from the vehicular access, but when there is a crossover, it should be marked with buff-colored blister surface. You know the stuff you see at every pedestrian crossing. The size of it should be at least 1.2 meter wide and 800 millimeter deep to give enough warning to people with impaired sight. On-site car parking and setting down should be sufficient for people wishing to access the site by car. Mobility impaired people should not struggle to get out of the car and onto the wheelchair, or generally to go about the car and access the main access to the building. British standard 8300 gives guidance on the provision of parking bays for different building types, ticket dispensing machines, vehicle control barriers and multi-story car parks. This standard will be generally applicable in many different circumstances for these buildings. So whenever you go about designing such building, BS 8300 will be a handy companion for you. Disabled parking bay should be positioned as close to the principal entrance as possible on the level ground, be at least 3.6 meter wide and 6 meter long, allowing 1.2 meter zone to the side of the car and its back or front, depending how you'll park. A dropped curb will be needed when accessing the pedestrian route, and the surface needs to be sound, slip resistant and not undulating more than 3 mm per 1 meter straight edge. Ticket machines will need to have controls at 750 mm to 1200 mm above the ground. For setting down point, surface should also be proper, the space clearly marked and as close to the building access entrance as possible, and level with it so to allow easy access. Ramps requirements should follow Part K unless Part M says otherwise. It is beneficial to have ramp and steps when needed, and for gradients up to 1 in 20, landing should be every 500 mm rise, but max every 10 meters of flight length. And for maximum gradients of 1 in 12, the going should be no more than 2 meters or each 166 mm rise. Railings should be provided on both sides, should be lit and of good surface. It is all about providing easy access for all different types of disabilities. Some people will be better at walking, some will need one-sided support, some will struggle to propel or stop a wheelchair. Therefore, the access route should be as easy for them as is feasible. When the total race is more than 2 meters, and mind you that the longest going is 10 meters for 500 mm rise, we will need to provide an alternative access. Lift could do the trick, or an alternative entrance. Ramp should be at least 1.5 meter wide with landing stop and bottom of at least 1.2 meter length, and any intermediate landing of 1.5 meter length at least. 1.8 meter by 1.8 meter landings for passing should be provided if the users cannot see the other side of the ramp or the ramp has three or more flights. Landings should be leveled but max gradient of 1 in 60 and crossfall of 1 in 40 with handrails on both sides. Ramp should have at least 100 mm height, visually distinct curb on its open side and clearly signposted stairs for the level change of at least 300 mm, meaning 2 steps. The stepped access should be marked to signal to the vision impaired people that it is there, especially at the top where the hazard of falling down the flight of stairs is the greatest. Frictional characteristics of all surfaces forming the access, so ramps, landing, stairs should be similar. Steps should not be slippery and easily to identify, avoiding open rises. Further guidance can be sought, guess where? In British Standard 8300. Level landings is a must, top and bottom of at least 1.2 meter length with so-called corduroy hazard warning top and bottom to alert people of impending stairs. It will need to be long enough so no one can stride over it without noticing, so at least 800 mm wide when the approach is head-on, and half that if we need to turn to go on the stairs. The spacing of the hazard marking and the stairs to be 400 mm top and bottom. Certain requirements for the spacing of strips and their size is also provided in document, being 20 mm ribs at 6 mm elevation with gaps of 30 mm between them. There should be no single steps, max 12 rises for goings, less than 350 mm, and 18 for goings greater than 350 mm. Contrasting nosing markers of at least 55 mm width should be placed at the rising and going part of the step, and the nosings to be no more than 25 mm. Raise should be between 150 and 170 mm and going between 280 and 425 mm. Preferred dimensions for school stairs are though 150 mm rise and 200 mm going. Raise may be different adjacent to existing buildings, but that needs to be agreed with the building control. Rises shan't be open, and stairs should have continuous handrail on each side of the stairs and landing. Extra wide stairs should be divided into not less than 1 meter portions, but not greater than 1.8 meter width sections, giving that odd jump to 2 meters when the stairs become more than 1.8 meters wide. Handrails, as ever, 300 mm post the bottom and top nosing at between 900 to 1 meter height over the pitch line of the stairs. Handrail should be grippable, soft to touch, and preferably usable as a forearm support. It should be rigidly supported and away from the wall to avoid finger gripping, which means at least 50 millimeters away from the wall and any other points where your fingers could get snapped in between. Round handrail should be between 32 and 50 millimeter diameter, and other shapes should be rounded at edges with radius of minimum 50 millimeters, but otherwise to be 50 millimeters wide and 39 millimeters deep. A diagram shows some additional dimensions that are worth considering. It should not protrude overly into the stairs to impede its use. Usually the limit is set at 100 mm protrusion, which is allowed. Hazard on access routes are generally addressed in sections of approved document K, section 6 and 10 in the gist, though there should be no protrusion permanent or temporarily that could injure a pedestrian during normal use of the access route. Off to section 2, which addresses access into buildings. In the gist, it is again we need to consider all users of the building and that access into the building should be easy to use for all and as hazard-free as possible. The document goes on to cover accessible entrances, doors to accessible entrances, manually operated non-powered entrance doors, powered entrance doors, glass doors and glazed screens, entrance lobbies. Accessible entrances may sometimes be difficult to be part of the principal access route. In such circumstances, we need to provide an alternative entry point. Such entrance should also be clearly signposted. The entry threshold should not cause unduly difficulty for wheelchairs or trip hazards. Ideally, they should be leveled but provide weather protection. Accessible entrances should be clearly signed, and guess what? There are expectations for the type of the signage also, which should be clearly visible and incorporated the international symbol of access. The signage should be visible from the edge of the site and from the principal entrance if it is not accessible. Accessible entrance should be clearly identifiable among other elements of the building. Landing in front of the doors should be clear and proper, easy for use by wheelchairs, so 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter turning space is generally needed. Level threshold is preferred, but otherwise cannot be higher than 50 mm, and any upstand over 5 mm should be rounded or chamfered. Any door access system needs to be accessible to deaf and hard of hearing people and people who cannot speak. Weather protection should be provided at manual non-powered entrance doors. The floor material behind the doors should be also good for wheelchair user, and if the entrance is the alternative, the internal accessible route should be provided to the space otherwise accessible by the primary entrance. Doors to accessible entrances should be easy to use by all and be capable of being held closed when not in use. Power or manual operated, it does not matter. It should be noted that the self-closing doors capable of closing against the wind forces with draft proofing are not likely to be user-friendly, so preference is given to power-assisted doors, preferably sliding doors. People should be able to see other people approaching from the other side, so to avoid collision, but in special circumstances, for security or privacy reasons, those may be obscured. Figures-wise, it means that the door, if operated manually, should be easy to do so using less than 30 newtons of force at the leading edge of the opening, from 0 to 30 degrees, and 22.5 newtons from 30 degrees to 60 degrees. This is universal for any doors anywhere in the building, for used by wheelchair users, used by people that are less able to move around. Effective clear width of the door will be between 750 mm to 775 mm in existing buildings, and for new buildings between 800 mm and 1 meter. In both cases, former is for straight-on approach, or to the side of 1.5 meter wide access route, or in general public access building, and approach to the side of the smaller access route. Tables and diagrams show nicely the dimensions and clearances required, so have a look at these. For manual doors, we need to think easy use and a 300 mm nip to the leading edge of the doors, operated manually. The latches and doors should be pleasant to touch and be operated with a closed fist. Unfortunately, not all can rely on the dexterity of the hand and fingers. Powered entrance doors should be easy and safe to use, allowing people enough time to react to the movement. The elements used to prepare them manually should be clearly visible. It should be noted that revolving doors are not considered accessible, so such should be provided immediately adjacent and signposted other doors. The doors should be easy to operate using a closed fist, far away from the leading edge of the door, and if the doors are opening towards the traffic, it should let the people know with audio and light that they are opening. These doors should not open into access routes. Controls should be at least at the level between 750 and 1 meter above the floor level. Glass doors and glaze screens should be visible so people do not walk into them, and they will be if they follow recommendation of section 7 of the approved document K. So let's talk about the entrance lobbies now. The document gives us a handy diagram with 6 different arrangements showing different doors arrangements and their locations. In the gist, there should be enough space to operate the wheelchair and open the door, so typically 300 mm nip at the leading edge and at least 1570 mm length and 1200 mm wide lobby. The actual size will depend which way the doors open. The lobby should be easy to traverse and free of hazards. If there are elements that protrude more than 100 mm into the lobby, this should be protected by clearly visible guardrails. Now, section 3 addresses horizontal and vertical circulation in buildings other than dwellings. It is all about moving unaided and with ease around the building, especially for the wheelchair user. This section goes to cover entrance hall and reception area, internal doors, corridors and passageways, internal lobbies, vertical circulation within the building, provision of lifting devices, general requirements for lifting devices, passenger lifts, lifting platforms, wheelchair platform stair lifts, internal stairs, internal ramps, handrails to internal steps, stairs and ramps. So plenty. Starting with the entrance hall and reception area. This being the first point of contact with the building, need to be particularly easy to navigate and move around. If there is a reception desk, part of it should be at a lower level to be able to talk sitting on both sides of the counter. We always think about all users, visitors and staff alike. We should think about the choice of materials and layouts so people who need to lip read or hear badly can gain appropriate information from either reception staff or notice boards. So ideally, the reception desk should be away from the entrance to alleviate external noise issues, but it should remain visible and easily accessible from the doors. Wheelchairs will need a bit of maneuvering space in front of the desk, and the extent will depend on whether there is a knee space at the desk of at least 500 mm or not. So 1200 deep by 1800 mm wide in the former case and 1400 by 2200 in latter. And the reception desk should be able to accommodate both seated and standing visitors, so at least one section of it for at least 1.5 meter at a level not higher than 7 760 millimeters should be provided with a knee recess of at least 700 millimeters. Audio enhancements should be provided, as well as the floor should remain slip resistant. Regarding internal doors, this should be open whenever possible, or of proper size and detail and easy to open. In fire case scenario, that may be achieved by release magnets if need be. As ever, BS 8300 offers some additional guidance on door systems. Doors, whether opened or closed, should also be apparent for visually impaired people. So in real terms, think how much force we need to open the doors with. The 30 and 22.5 newtons are universal. The clear width of doors between 750 and 1 meter, depending on the position of the approach. If it's an existing building or a new, 300 millimeter nip to the leading edge unless the doors are automatic or lead to a standard hotel bedroom. Be capable to open door latch with closed fists, or opening them with fists. That would be something. Surely some people can. Door opening furniture contrasts with the doors, and door frames contrast with the wall. If the door remains open, the edge should contrast also, so no one walks into the open doors. Also, think vision panels to door leaves wider than 450 millimeters, providing the view of other side at the level of 500 to 1500 millimeters above floor level. Glass doors to be marked so visible, and electromagnetic door holders to release self-closing doors when activated by the alarm system or when the power supply fails and activated by a hand-operated switch. Fire doors should be generally closed by a swing-free device, especially if leading to individual rooms. Any power-operating swing door system should be operational in all states, manually, power-assisted or in power mode. Corridors and passageways should be wide enough for a wheelchair to reverse or people with luggage and crutches to pass each other. Some localized narrowing, however, may be necessary, but that should not in general make the corridor unusable. The contrast between walls and ceilings and floor should be considered, as well as the good use of materials, colors, textures and lights to assist people with sight impairments. The acoustic of the places should also be as natural as possible, avoiding excessive reverberation or absorption of sound. So they should be at least 1200 mm wide in general. Some projections into the space may be unavoidable, but in general their width is less than 1800 mm. We need to provide such at intervals for people to pass each other. So that space, 1.8 meter by 1.8 meter every now and again, will be likely needed and is well placed at corridor junctions. Generally, gradient shouldn't be more than 1 in 60, and if needed, gradient steeper than 1 in 20 should be treated as an internal ramp. For in-between gradients, every 500 mm rise, we need to provide a rest place of 1.5 meter long. Typically, no doors open onto the passageway, and any sloping are identified and edged when needed. Utility or cupboard doors may open onto the corridor. Unisex accessible toilet doors may project onto not main or escape routes if the route is at least 1.5 meter wide. On the same escape route, all doors to be of the same orientation, so people do not guess between doors which way or how to open them. Textures, anti-slip surfaces and manifested glass in general should be used. For schools, preferred locker corridor should be 2.7 meter wide. Internal lobbies. In the gist, there needs to be enough space between the doors for a wheelchair user to use both unaided. Typically 1570 mm between the door swings, at least 1200 mm wide. But door plus 300 mm nip, whichever is the greater. Glazing to not distract people, any projections into the width to be visible and guard-railed, and there should be no trip hazard between different materials, typically pavement to mat, mat to internal surface. Vertical circulation should ideally be served by a lift, always by an ambulant person accessible stairs, maybe also ramps, readily apparent from the lift. Floor identification should be provided at each level. Lifts are always the most suitable for all. Lifting platforms may be used in constrained situations or even a wheelchair platform stair lift, but it's all within the reason and allowing proper circulation of people when such are in use. General requirements for lifting devices are included in other legislation concerning lifts, including lifting equipment and even Management of Health and Safety at Work Act. Think Lift Regulations 1997, Lifting Operations and Lifting Equipment Regulation 1998, the Provision and Use of Work Equipment Regulations 1998, the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, and on. Lighting should be proper, balanced, and people should not have difficulty operating the lift. Space in front of the lift should be the typical 1.5 by 1.5 meter or approach straight from a 900 mm wide space. Buttons should be positioned between 900 and 1.1 meter above the floor and at least 500 mm away from any return. The floor should not be dark with same or better frictional parameters than the landing, with a rail at 900 mm not obstructing controls or a mirror. Emergency communication system should be provided. Passenger lifts should be typically minimum of 1.1 meter wide by 1.4 meter deep. However, 2 meter wide will be more functional for mixed passengers use. All the tactile numbers, buttons, visual and audible communication about the floor and operation of the lift should be provided. If planning allows a lift between two levels, may be provided with two doors to allow straight-through wheelchair use. Have a look into lift regulations and BSEN 81 for more information. Door clear width should be at least 800 mm and controls position between 900 to 1.2 meter, at least 400 mm from any return. Lift landing and door should be visually contrasted with the adjoining walls. If the lift is to be used for evacuation, it should conform to BS 5588 Part 8, Fire Precaution in the Design, Construction and Use of Buildings, Code of Practice for Means of Escape for Disabled People. Lifting platforms should be provided only between levels or stories, with continuous pressure control and, as ever, good for all people using them. So signals, visual and audible, tactile features, contrasting elements and so on should be considered. They should abide by relevant standards, and if they travel more than 3 meters they should be certified by a notified body. Lifts traveling more than 2 meters will need to be enclosed, and the speed of such should not exceed 0.15 meters per second. Controls, so 1 step a second. Controls should be at between 800 to 1.1 millimeters of the floor and 400 millimeters from any return wall. Landing call buttons should be at 900 millimeters to 1.1 meter and 500 millimeters away from any returns. Minimum dimensions for not enclosed platform is 800 wide and 1250 millimeters deep, and 900 by 1400 millimeters when enclosed, or 1100 wide if doors are at 90 degrees to each other. Doors should have a clear width between 800 and 900 millimeters depending on the ease of access. There should be a clear instruction for the user of the lift fitted. Wheelchair platform stair lifts are intended for wheelchair users only and should not restrict the safe use of the stairs otherwise. Should be constantly pressure controlled, supervised during use, and easy to instruct the person in their operation. They should meet supply of machinery regulation and BSEN 81 or have notified body approval. Minimum size of the platform to be 800 mm wide by 1250 mm deep, fitted with clear instruction for use and clear access of at least 800 mm. Controls should be designed to prevent unauthorized use. Internal stairs should have a hazard warning surface on the landing apart from otherwise meeting approved document K considerations. It should be noted that mobility impaired people benefit from goings of at least 300 mm. Internal ramps should be avoided, but if they are for more than 2 risers, we should also provide alternative steps as ambulant disabled people often struggle up the ramps. Meeting guidance of approved document K will be sufficient otherwise. Handrails to internal steps stairs and ramps will be sufficient if they follow approved document K, section 1 to section 3 guidance. This leads us nicely to section 4, which addresses facilities in buildings, which should be provided so everyone can use the building in full, no matter if they are visitor or work in the building, no matter their sex, age or ability. That includes spectator places where wheelchair users should be capable of watching without obstructing the views or others. In refreshment facilities, bars and counters, wheelchair users should have at least part of them made accessible, and all floors should also be accessible. A proportion of the sleeping accommodation in hotels, motels and student accommodation should be designed for independent use by wheelchair users. The remaining should have facilities that at least cater to people with mild disabilities. The document goes on to cover audience and spectator facilities, refreshment facilities, sleeping accommodation, switches, outlets and controls, and aids to communication. Starting with the audience and spectator facilities, you may expect it is all about the balance and making the venues accessible. The document recognizes 3 primary categories: lecture conference facilities, entertainment facilities like theaters and cinemas, sports facilities like stadia. This guidance mainly concerns seating provisions for the guidance on reception and sales counters we are referred to in section 3 of this document. Now, audience facilities will concentrate on not segregating the wheelchair person from the rest, allowing a company including a space for a dog and position close enough to allow the person to leap or sign read. All that space can be temporarily used in the interim by provision of removable seating, which can be removed whenever needed. The spaces should contrast with the rest, and it should be assured that moving around the facilities should be a straightforward affair and a safe making sure that people are safe and they can easily locate their seats. There should be at least 1% of total seating capacity in the form of permanent wheelchair spaces up to 10,000 seatings. Numbers should be rounded up, and for larger venues we are directed to the publication called Accessible Stadia, a good practice guide to the design of facilities to meet the needs of disabled spectators and other users. When it comes to the removable wheelchair spaces for up to 600 people, venues should be at least 6 in total spaces that can be made up with removable chairs. For venues over 600 people, we may provide some as desired. For lecture and conference facilities, we should make sure all participants can see and hear clearly, so light and position of speakers and screens is important. Entertainment, leisure and social facilities can be packed more densely, so we need to make sure the provision of wheelchair accommodation does not obstruct other people. We are referenced to the technical standard for places of entertainment. For sport facilities, on the other hand, we are directed to the Guide to Safety at Sports Grounds. Accessible Stadia, a good practice guide to design of facilities to meet the needs of disabled spectators and other users and accessible sports facilities. In the gist though, the route to wheelchair spaces should be accessible. Stepped access routes to audience seatings are provided with handrails. Some wheelchair spaces come in twos. More than 2 wheelchair spaces should be spread to allow different views. Spread should be typically front, back and sides. The minimum space for access to wheelchairs is 900 mm and the parked wheelchair space is 900 by 1400. The floor should be horizontal. The document says, I think they mean leveled. Some seats should be located so the assistant's dog can rest in front or under the seat, and the standard seats next to the wheelchair space or the edge should have removable or lift up arms. Step terraced floor seating should have wheelchair spaces to the back, and where the podium or stage is provided, the wheelchair users should benefit of a ramp or a lifting platform to gain access to it. Hearing aids may also be necessary. For refreshment facilities, let me reiterate, accessible, including for the impaired staff. Counter to be accessible needs to be at not higher level than 850 millimeters with clear space under to 700 millimeters above the floor level. Wheelchair accessible thresholds are installed between the exterior and interior, and 1.5 by 1.5 meter wheelchair working space should be considered. Sleeping accommodation should also accommodate everyone, and where accessible bedrooms are provided, these preferably should be with and suite showers and have doors, curtains and windows operated remotely. Even bedrooms that are not designated accessible should have doors wide enough to admit a wheelchair. Accessible bedrooms may be connected with the adjacent companion room, and generally the use of electronic locks and levers in bathrooms is preferential to accommodate people with lower dexterity. All bedrooms should have wide enough doors, built-in wardrobes and other storage system to have doors opening 180 degrees. Handles and hinges and sliding doors should be easy to grip. Windows controls at 800 mm to 1 meter over the floor. Visual fire alarm and any door number should be indicated with embossed characters. For wheelchair accessible bedrooms, we should think of at least one room per 20 bedrooms, located on accessible route that leads to all other facilities in the building. They need to be of the same standard as other rooms. Doors leading to the room should have the typical nib and low force operation, have enough space to maneuver around the room and into the bed, approaching it from the side. There are some expectations to the angle views in the doors that, if provided, to be at 50 millimeters to 1.5 meter above floor level. Balcony doors not to have transoms at 900 to 1.2 meters. We also need to think about the alarm code and alarm signal outside the bedroom so people can react. Switches, outlets and controls simply need to be visible, accessible and easy to operate, preferably so placed and specified so a person using it does not inadvertently use it or the adjacent switch by mistake. They should be positioned depending on their function, so sockets are 400 to 1 meter above the floor, switches 400 to 1.2 meters unless needed higher. All precise hand movement controllers at 750 to 1.2 meter. Simple push buttons not higher than 1.2 meter on. You get the gist. When you design the room, just check the dimensions first and some other expectations too, like the switches should indicate whether they are on or off. Aids to communication, meaning wayfinding, public address system and hearing enhancement. When designing and spacing spaces, we should think colors, textures and acoustic of rooms and use of systems like induction loops, for example. And this leads us nicely to section 5, which addresses sanitary accommodation in buildings other than dwellings. Again, here we need to think about the needs of all users of the building, but in the case of ambulance sanitary accommodation, we are being directed to the new approved document T. We are also reminded that keeping layouts of buildings simple will assist people with learning difficulties. This section goes to cover sanitary accommodation generally, provision of toilet accommodation, wheelchair accessible unisex toilets, toilet in separate sex washrooms, wheelchair accessible changing and shower facilities, wheelchair accessible bathrooms. Sanitary accommodation generally should cater for a plethora of people, especially those less capable of going about their daily life. Doors to the WC cubicles or toilets should, whenever possible, be open to the outside, but capable to being open if someone collapses inside, and should allow enough space for the wheelchair. Large push pads for the operation of light switches should take precedence to pull cords. So, think automatic or levered operation. The aspect of controlling things with a closed fist permeates the whole document. Terminal fitting should comply with Guidance Note G18.5 of the guidance document relating to Schedule 2 requirements for water fittings of the Water Supply Water Fittings Regulations 1999. Ironmongery needs to be operated by a closed fist and contrast visually. Doors should be easily to use with the Newton force for the operation that applies universally everywhere. water closet compartment doors and doors to wheelchair accessible unisex toilets, changing rooms or shower rooms should have a release mechanism that allows them to be opened outwards in case of an emergency. Doors should not obstruct emergency escape routes, and any fire alarms emits a visual and audible signal for hearing or visual impairments. Any emergency assistance alarm should have visual and audible confirmation of the emergency call being received, a wheelchair reachable reset button, and a signal that is different to the fire alarm. Switches and controls should be proper, and heating emitters either be guarded or under 43 degrees centigrade temperature to not scald people. The space elements should be visually contrasting to one another, so wall to floor to sanitary fittings should be easily distinguishable by people with impaired vision. Toilet accommodation again should be suitable for wheelchair user, ideally located in a separate room, as should be a unisex wheelchair user room even if there is a provision in the separate sex toilet already. The unisex type should not be used for the baby changing facilities though. Also, consult approved document T to facilitate the reasonable provision of single-sex toilets in buildings other than dwellings. The guidance found in BS 8300 is useful here when it comes to the provision of enlarged cubicles or simply rooms with changing facilities. What does all of it mean? And it means if there is space only for one toilet, it should be of unisex type wheelchair accessible, but with greater width to accommodate a standing wash basin. At least one such toilet to be provided at the location with sanitary facilities. There should be at least one water cubicle provided for the ambulant disabled person in separate sex toilet accommodation. If there is 4 or more cubicles in such toilet, one should be of increased space in addition. There should be at least one changing places toilet provided in the assembly, recreation and entertainment buildings with a capacity for 350 people or more, or in cohort of buildings used for an assembly, recreation or entertainment with a capacity of 2,000 people and more. Places like zoos, theme parks, venues for sports. Shopping centers, malls, retail parks with a gross floor area of 30,000 meters square or more, retail premises with a gross floor area of 2,500 meters square or more, sports and leisure buildings of 5,000 meters square or more, hospitals, primary care centers, ceremonial and cemetery buildings, or any other building that falls under this threshold, admitting general public for the purpose of assembly, recreation or entertainment. For changing places in school, seek guidance of the Department for Education guidance for schools providing community facilities. If the number of persons is unknown, we are directed to methods of approved document B to establish such. Let's now consider wheelchair accessible unisex toilets. We need to make sure there is enough provision for this, and it needs to be easy to use by a plethora of people on wheelchairs, so approach points of support and transfer to and from the wheelchair, as well as the capability to wash and dry your hands seated on the water closet should be considered. The toilet should be separated and as close to the entry to sanitary facilities as possible. The idea for space inside is to allow a wheelchair user and up to 2 people in. WC pans following BSEN 997 standards will be acceptable as the level of the pan is too critical and different people will require its position at a different level. So to achieve this, the toilet should be provided as close to the entrance or waiting area of the building as possible, and it should not compromise the privacy of the user. In multi-story buildings, they should be provided in a similar position and allow alternating transfer sides at alternate stories, or as the case may be between other such toilets on one story in a single-story building. If there is only one such toilet, it should be wider than the standard 1.5 meters. It should be 2 meters to allow for the standing height wash basin in addition to the finger rinse basin. The toilet doors should be preferably open to the outside, and they should be located on the accessible routes. 40 meters of travel is generally the limit for travel. The size and the arrangement of such toilets, either on plan or elevation, are given in diagrams contained within the document. I trust the picture does much more than talk, but you can expect that all bases have been covered, including the relative position of these elements. For the overall size, the bathroom starts at the size of 1.5 meter wide and 2.2 meters length, and the center line of the toilet 500 millimeters away from the side wall, and the front edge of the pan 750 millimeters away from the back wall. The finger basin edge 140 to 160 millimeters to the edge of the water closet pan, and so on. Have a look in the diagram. The toilet should be fitted with an alarm assistance system, and call signal outside the toilet should be located such people can react to it. Expectation for the heat emitters, alarm codes, access, water closet pans, conformity to British Standard European Norm 997, and the position of the flushing mechanisms is all regulated. Toilets in separate sex washrooms. Here we go as far as making sure ambulant disabled people are catered for, so at least one compartment with support rails and minimum activity space is required, with a water closet pan capable of accepting variable height toilet seat rises. There are some additional provisions dealing with minimum space for movement within the water closet compartment, and these are contained in approved document T. We should also think about the provision of fold-down table and larger space for people with luggage or baby strollers in toilets of certain sizes. When these toilets can be accessed by wheelchair users, it should be possible for them to use urinals and wash basins. It is being considered that in general there should be as many water closets for women as urinals for men, but for large buildings like retail at least twice as many. Also, we need to think about little lads using men's toilets. In practice, it looks like this. There needs to be at least 465 mm space between the swing of the inward swinging doors and anything else. Dimensions for the compartments suitable for ambulant disabled people should be at least 920 mm wide by 1465 mm long. Also, see approved document T for more details. And large compartment to be at least 1200 mm wide, and room generally have all bells and whistles needed to assist the use of the compartment, including the water closet pan to BS 997. For wheelchair accessible compartments, same rules apply as for the unisex one. Wheelchair accessible changing and shower facilities in the gist should be fit for purpose and may include a WC, but then a separate one will need to be provided too. The case is always the same. Enough space to move around and have a person helping you out, and enough support to assist use. Not to mention any possible hazard of scalding or injury removed from the areas, and if possible, two-way transfer to the sitting area should be provided. Size-wise, we talk at least 2 meters by 2.2 meters for changing rooms and shower rooms, increasing to 2.5 by 2.4 meters for the shower room, incorporating water closet, alarm cords and all the bells and whistles. The document provides sufficient diagrams and directs us for more to BS 8300. When the shower is positioned in the communal area, shower control should be between 750 to 1 meter over the floor. Now, with the wheelchair accessible bathrooms, the logic follows the previous parts, and the minimum size of such rooms with incorporated water closets should be 2.5 meter by 2.7 meter. The guidance of this part applies to bathrooms in hotels, motels, relatives accommodation, in hospital, and the student accommodation, and sports facilities provided as an alternative to the showers. Different rules apply to hotel and suites. So this is it, folks. The approved document M, Access to and Use of Buildings Volume 2, Buildings Other than Dwellings. Let's sum it up section by section. The document outlines accessibility requirements for buildings, emphasizing that the key to compliance is meeting functional performance, allowing all individuals, regardless of age, gender, or disability, to access and use the building's facilities. These requirements apply to new builds as well as existing buildings undergoing major alterations, extensions or changes in use, referencing the Equality Act 2010 to ensure physical barriers do not impede access. Designers must demonstrate compliance with these requirements, particularly for public spaces, educational establishments and historical buildings where some concessions may be needed. When designing extensions, accessibility must be considered for all routes from the site boundary or car park to the new building, with provisions for appropriate sanitary facilities. Material alteration must not worsen existing access, and material changes in use may necessitate upgrades to meet modern standards. The general principle is to ensure that people can navigate to, within and between buildings with appropriate assistance where needed, particularly in complex developments. Section 1 focuses on access to buildings, detailing requirements from the site boundary or parking area to the building entrance, including consideration for ramps, steps, handrails and hazards. Access routes should be level, firm, slip-resistant, well-lit and unobstructed, with dimensions provided for different elements like pathways, parking bays and ramps. The document also references best practices such as inclusive mobility guides, and provides detailed specifications for slopes, surfaces, signage and tactile marking to assist people with different disabilities. Section 2 addresses access into buildings, specifying that entrances must be easily usable and hazard-free for all users, including those with disabilities. It covers requirements for accessible entrances, doors and lobbies, emphasizing clear signage, level thresholds, appropriate door widths and easy-to-operate doors, whether manual or powered. Powered doors, if used, must be safe with clear controls and notifications, and revolving doors must always have accessible alternatives. Glass doors should be visible to prevent accidents, and entrance lobbies must be spacious enough to accommodate wheelchairs and prevent hazards. Section 3 takes us to horizontal and vertical circulation in buildings, focuses on ensuring ease of movement for all users, especially wheelchair users, in non-residential buildings. It covers the design of entrance halls, internal doors, corridors, lobbies, stairs and lifts, promoting accessible circulation across all areas. The section emphasizes proper layout, space requirements and materials, including specific guidance for maneuvering spaces, door widths and gradients. Compliance with safety standards for lifts, ramps and stairs is mandatory to facilitate seamless movement for individuals with varied mobility needs. Section 4, facilities in buildings, ensures that all users, including visitors and staff, can access and use a building regardless of their abilities, sex or age. It covers seating provisions for wheelchair users, in spectators areas, accessible refreshment counters, and adaptable sleeping accommodation in hotels and student residences. Specific guidelines are provided for lecture halls, entertainment venues, and sports facilities to ensure wheelchair access without segregating users, along with details on wheelchair spaces and seating arrangements. The importance of accessible switches, controls, and communication aids like induction loops for hearing enhancement is mentioned. Section 5, sanitary accommodation in buildings, outlines requirements for toilets, changing facilities and showers to accommodate all users, particularly wheelchair users and those with disabilities. It mandates that sanitary facilities be spacious, accessible, and fitted with proper support rails, emergency alarm systems, and user-friendly controls. Special provisions are made for wheelchair-accessible unisex toilets, which should be located near building entrances and on accessible routes. Furthermore, guidelines ensure that separate sex washrooms, changing rooms, and bathrooms are suitable for disabled users, offering proper maneuvering space and necessary aids for safety and comfort. In the next episode, we will move to approved document O, overheating. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that the considerations of the approved document M access to and use of buildings volume 2, buildings other than dwellings, are clear for you now. I know this type of content needs to be listened to as you go on specify and designing things, otherwise it is nearly impossible to intake it all at once, but here it is for you should you ever need it. If you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you out. In Bytna, we deal with planning, designing and managing of your projects, and we are always glad to facilitate a free initial consultation to steer you in the right direction. Visit www.bytna.co.uk and reach out to us. Whether your question is if we can help you with your project or what should I do, we will be able to give you a piece of non-obligatory advice. At Bytna, we help our clients design and execute their dream homes or investments. If your building is falling apart, we can also help investigate the reasons behind it and to provide you with an appropriate strategy, design and specifications for the repair. Thank you again for listening. Please voice up your opinions. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and I want to hear from you. See you next week. Bytna designs the world around you. Toodaloo.